Our reading today from the Gospel is from the book of Matthew, chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, "If you're the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But Jesus answered, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him into the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "Okay, if you're the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." But Jesus said to him, "Again, it is written, do not put the Lord God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in their splendor. And he said to Jesus, "All these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only God." Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. Well, today is the first day of Lent, which is an interesting time to come as your guest preacher. And I love that you have a preacher that goes cross-country skiing with you. That's so cool. So the Lenten journey begins today with a reading from Genesis that will perhaps help us understand why we need to go on this journey in the first place. Basically, God created Adam and then Eve and gave them some pretty simple instructions about being alive in the garden, which was beautiful and adequate and abundant. A paradise, really, a true don't worry, be happy situation. It was perfect. But alas, one day, despite the beautiful beauty and innocence of creation, Eve encountered a clever, crafty serpent who enticed her, and Adam got involved also, to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, the tree of the knowledge of everything, the one tree God said not to eat of. And as you know, this got them into a whole heap of trouble. Eden was never the same again, nor were Adam and Eve, and we, their heirs and kin, have pretty much been paying the price ever since. One interesting thing to note is that in the Hebrew version of the Genesis reading, Adam and Eve were not so much commanded to till the garden, as Nancy read to you, as it reads also in the 1611 publication of the King James Bible. They were to serve the garden. Adam and Eve were also charged with protecting the garden. They were not put in control of the garden. They were to serve and protect it. Essentially, they were to be stewards of the garden, an especially relative point, I think, in light of the devastation human beings have wrought on this beautiful planet, this creation over time. Theologian John Holbert writes, "God made us to serve and protect the great garden of God, but we would rather control and plunder and take over, forgetting that God is creator and sustainer of all of us and of all of our cosmos." So little wonder that we again this year need to go on a Lenten journey, searching for the light and the leading of our God. And so here we are, Stowe, Vermont, February 22nd, 2,000 years or so after the birth of Christ. Heaven knows how many years after Adam and Eve dwelled in that garden, still searching for the light and the leading of God. Now let's fast forward to today's reading in Matthew, in which we find Jesus right after his baptism at the hands of John, being led up by the Spirit into the wilderness. All alone in the barren backcountry, Jesus fasts for 40 days and 40 nights, which is a very long time. And afterwards, when he's well famished and no doubt exhausted and lonely, Satan strikes again, this time with a series of offers, specially and creatively designed to tempt him to forsake God and go for a more immediate, accessible, concrete forms of relief and power. Jesus says no to Satan 3 times, and finally, "Away with you, Satan," he says, or maybe even shouts, "for it's written, worship the Lord your God and serve only God." At which point the devil leaves him and angels come and wait for him. Now, theologian Peter Woods comments that the way Matthew tells the story points out that despite the wilderness temptation struggle of the faithful, fasting, famished Jesus, this battle does not happen in a place where God is absent. Remember, the wilderness was the place where the fledgling Israel, fresh out of Egypt, learned devotion and dependence to their God. Now, there's a story told by a pastor named Kyle Childress about how at his ordination in a small rural Baptist church in Texas, Childress, a brand new pastor, had invited a retired minister whom he had known from college days to preach the ordination sermon. The retired preacher in his mid-80s was gentle and kind and attentive to others and had a deep prayer life and an enviable knowledge of the Bible. After the ordination, everyone gathered for a church dinner to celebrate, after which the newly ordained young pastor escorted the older preacher to his car. But before getting into the car, the older man laid his Bible on the roof of the car as he opened the door and turned to the younger man. "There are two more things you need to know about being a pastor," he said. You'll need to learn to say no, and you will need to learn to say hell no." With those parting words, he got in his car and drove away. I thought of a story as I was reading this, which happened a long, long time ago when I had my first church, which was in Rupert, Vermont, which is where I grew up. They basically hired me over the kitchen sink, and we made a deal. I wasn't even done with divinity school yet, in my early 20s. And I would come up from Boston and preach on the weekends and go back. And it was a lot of people I'd grown up with as a child. So it was a really interesting, very rural church. But I really loved them, and they really loved me, I think, too. And somewhere my name is on a plaque there. I don't know. You can visit it if you ever go down there. Anyway, but one time we decided to take the church youth group to this, they were in Glens Falls or Granville. They were having a Saturday night some kind of Easter play. So we thought, well, let's just pile in a van and take the youth group over to Granville and see the Easter play, because tomorrow's Sunday, which is Easter. So we got in our van and we went and saw this Easter play. It was in a great big auditorium, and I thought the play was horrible. It was all white, very coiffed. Jesus had beautiful hair and very neat and just going around like very neatly blessing everybody. At the end, there was this altar call where they were like trying to bribe you basically to come down and get blessed by them. The whole thing I thought was just horrific. But anyway, so we came back, and then the next morning was Sunday, which I preached, Easter Sunday, and one thing I talked about was that play. And I just said, to me, that just does not really embody the gospel message, which to me is messy and dangerous and cool and, loving and, moving. And anyway, we gave the sermon, Easter was over, and then I was leaving, and then this one woman, Mary Lowry, who was about 80 years old, came up with me with her eyes as big as Frisbees and said, "Catherine, there's a young man who wants to talk to you. I think he was there last night." So back I go with this young man who was part of that church group in my back office, and he basically took to telling me, "You are going to hell, your church is going to hell, you have no idea what you're doing, this is not a Christian church," on and on and on. And here I was 23, 24, and I thought, my God, he's right. He's right. I'm terrible. The church is going to hell. I don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, I was just like, he was shaking and pale and anxious. And I was just like, this is just such a strange moment. And I suppose I prayed in a way, as one does when you're cornered. And I just suddenly looked at him. I thought, wait a minute. I don't want what this young man has. He's pale, he's anxious, he's righteous, he's mean. And I thought, if he were really from Jesus, then this wouldn't be happening. And I just relaxed, and I just thanked him, and that was over. And I just let him go, because I realized he wasn't right. If he was right, I would want to follow him, but I didn't. So anyway, hold that thought. So after his baptism by John in the river Jordan, Jesus went into the wilderness and learned, among other things, to say no. Christ said yes to God in his baptism, but in order to pursue his vocation, Christ had to struggle through what his vocation was not. After the wilderness experience and his interaction with Satan, Jesus returned to Nazareth and preached in his hometown synagogue, which is when his ministry and teaching got going. But hold on, not so fast, because Lent is the time we consider what took place between Jesus' baptism and his first sermon in that hometown synagogue. And this between time is the wilderness, the hunger, the solitude, the isolation, the loneliness, the temptation. It's in the wilderness that the gospel shows us what Jesus will not do, who Jesus will not be. In other words, the gospels show us that resistance is part of Jesus' vocation, part of Jesus' divine call, part of Jesus' coming of age as a savior and as a human being. Jesus learns that saying no or resisting what he knows in his heart is wrong for him is a fundamental part of his ministry. And we as Christians learn right along with him. So many years ago, as Childress tells it, two well-known theologians spoke at Vanderbilt Divinity School. The first speaker's lecture was very simple. He sat behind a desk, and after being introduced, he stood up and said, "The vocation of a Christian at this time in this country is resistance." With that, he sat down, and chaos ensued. People jumped to their feet. They were angry. They were shaking their fists over this powerful man's simple and way too short talk. It wasn't even a talk. It was a pronouncement. Meanwhile, the second speaker sat on the stage looking rather amused, taking all of this in. At last, he said himself to the assembled crowd, "Well, I don't know who that first speaker is, but to me, he sounds like a prophet." So in the wilderness, as we read today, Jesus resisted. And the first theologian's point is that, like Jesus, we are called to resist also in our own lives. But for this theologian, whose name was Bill Stringfellow, the ability to resist is predicated, as it was for Jesus, upon baptism. Because in baptism, we surrender the God of all life. In baptism, we surrender to goodness, to a loving God as we understand God. For Stringfellow, baptism is not about being sprinkled neatly and discreetly with the water of holiness. Rather, he uses the language of immersion when he talks about how we surrender to God. No more dabbling will do, he says. I think when I read all this, which is quite religious, but I think of the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, in which the third step reads, "Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood God." Also written into the literature of the program are the promises which tell of the good things that will happen for those who diligently work the steps of the program and move into sober living. The promises will always materialize if we work for them, the literature says. And one of those promises reads, "We intuitively knew how to handle situations that used to baffle us." We intuitively knew how to handle situations that used to baffle us. So reading about Jesus and his temptation by Satan in the wilderness, and about this idea of baptism as surrender to and immersion in a loving God, and how resistance comes from an inner sense that we are God's and no one else's, I think about this idea of surrender or baptism as a kind of decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of a loving God as we understand God. And how it is true that eventually, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, with time and work and prayer and meditation, confession, life, experience, we are able to find within ourselves the strength, the intuition, the connection, the inner guidance with which to intuitively handle situations that once baffled us. From a sense of our belonging and connection to God, we are able to know when and how to resist, to say no, or even hell no, to that which would hurt ourselves, our neighbors, our community, our environment, and our world. I think again of myself, a fledgling young pastor, fresh out of divinity school, early 20s, younger than my youngest child is now, shaken to the very roots of my being by the anxious, opinionated, righteous young man from the traveling evangelical Christian group, confronting me with the temptation to believe that I was, as he truly believed I was, utterly misguided as a minister, a person, a shepherd, a follower of Jesus, and a channel of inspiration and love for the people of my congregation. And then again, suddenly, while listening to him go on and on, there was this flash of knowing that came as I listened to his words. The clear realization that I didn't want what he had, that he was not speaking truth as I in my life had come to know truth. Where did that knowing come from? It came from within. It came from inspiration, from intuition, from a place inside myself carved out and nurtured by hard work, mentors, prayer, learning, worship, pain, joy, losing, loving, becoming, friendship, life lived, a growing connection with a higher power over time. So during the 1950s, a Dutch-born American clergyman and political activist named D.J. Must stood outside the gate of a strategic air command base alone, holding a sign that read, "Ban the bomb." Each day he stood in silent vigil, all by himself. A reporter watched him and after a week or so approached Must and said, "You aren't going to change anyone doing this." To which Must replied, "I know, but I can keep them from changing me." There is much more to the gospel than saying no, but this first Sunday in Lent, as we learn about Jesus in the wilderness, it's perhaps a good place to begin. Amen.